March 11, 1960, Federal Courthouse, St. Louis, Missouri. Chuck Berry sat perfectly still as Judge George Moore's gavel cracked against mahogany, the sound echoing through the packed courtroom like a gunshot. Guilty on all counts. The words hung in the stale air, heavy with cigarette smoke and the sweat of 30 reporters scribbling furiously. 5 years in federal prison, a $5,000 fine. The destruction of the most revolutionary musical career in American history. But what the jury of 12 white men didn't understand was that they hadn't just convicted Charles Edward Anderson Berry. They had declared war on rock and roll itself. Chuck's fingers remained motionless on the defendant's table, the same fingers that had created Johnny B. Goode and Roll Over Beethoven, the same hands that had taught white teenagers how to move their bodies to black music. Behind him, the gallery erupted. Reporters pushed toward the front. Camera bulbs flashed like artillery fire. His wife Themetta sobbed quietly in the third row, her handkerchief pressed against her mouth. But Chuck didn't turn around. He stared straight ahead at Judge Moore, memorizing the satisfaction in those pale gray eyes, understanding with crystalline clarity that this moment had been inevitable from the second he'd first plugged in his guitar. Because this trial wasn't really about Janice Escalante, the 14-year-old Apache girl Chuck had met in a Juarez cantina 3 months earlier. This wasn't even about the Mann Act, that convenient 1910 law that had already destroyed Jack Johnson and would be wielded against any black man who dared step outside the boundaries white America had drawn. This was about something far more dangerous, the terrifying possibility that a black man from St. Louis had figured out how to speak directly to white children, bypassing their parents, their preachers, their politicians, and every other guardian of racial order. Chuck Berry had committed the ultimate crime in 1960s America. He had made integration sound like fun. The path to this courtroom had begun exactly 4 years, 3 months, and 16 days earlier, though Chuck wouldn't realize it until much later. May 21, 1955, Chess Records, Chicago. Chuck had walked in carrying his guitar and a head full of country music melodies, thinking he was just another black musician trying to make a buck in the blues business. But when he'd played Ida Red for Leonard Chess, reworking the old fiddle tune with his own electric guitar licks and storytelling lyrics about cars and teenage romance, he'd accidentally created something that didn't exist before. Music that white kids could dance to and black kids could claim as their own. Maybelline hit the charts 3 months later, climbing to number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100. White disc jockeys played it because they thought it was country music with a beat. Black radio stations played it because Chuck Berry was undeniably one of their own. Teenagers of both races bought the record because it spoke their language, sang about their world, captured their restless energy in 3 minutes and 12 seconds of pure electricity. But in the boardrooms of major record labels, in the offices of conservative newspapers, in the back rooms of Southern police stations, people were beginning to ask questions. Who was this Chuck Berry? What exactly was he doing to America's children? By 1959, those questions had become accusations. Chuck Berry owned 3 Cadillacs, a sprawling estate in Wentzville, Missouri, and the hottest nightclub in St. Louis. His songs were being covered by white artists from coast to coast, but his name remained on the songwriter credits. His publishing company collected the royalties. He was becoming rich and famous by writing about teenage life in language that teenagers understood, and every screaming white girl at his concerts represented a small crack in the foundation of segregated society. But success had made Chuck careless, or maybe just tired of pretending to be grateful for America's conditional acceptance. He dated white women openly, drove his Cadillacs through downtown St. Louis with the top down, spoke his mind to reporters who expected him to shuffle and grin. The FBI had opened a file on him in 1957, the same year School Days went to number 3. By 1959, J. Edgar Hoover's agents were following him on tour, photographing him entering hotels, documenting every interaction with white fans. They were building a case, waiting for the right moment, the right weapon. The Mann Act gave them everything they needed. December 1, 1959, had started like any other show day. Chuck and his band rolled into El Paso, Texas for a concert at the Coliseum, their Cadillac loaded with guitars and amplifiers. Before the show, they'd crossed the border into Juarez for lunch, a common practice for touring musicians looking to escape the suffocating segregation of American venues. The cantina was dim and smoky, filled with locals and a few American tourists seeking cheap thrills south of the border. That's where Chuck noticed her. Janice Escalante sat alone at a corner table, picking at a plate of food she clearly couldn't afford. She was small, dark-skinned, with intelligent eyes that seemed older than her face. When Chuck asked the waitress about her, he learned she was homeless, working occasionally as a waitress or worse, sleeping in alleys when she couldn't find a room. She claimed to be 21, but Chuck could see she was younger. How much younger, he would claim not to know. What happened next would be disputed in 2 trials, appealed to federal court, and argued by lawyers for the next 3 years. Chuck's version was simple. He offered Janice a job as a hostess at his club bandstand in St. Louis, a chance to get off the streets, make honest money, maybe even finish school. She accepted. They drove to St. Louis together over the course of a week, stopping in hotels along the way. She worked at his club for 10 days before he fired her for coming on to customers. 3 weeks later, she went to the St. Louis police with a different story. The government's version painted Chuck as a predator who had transported a minor across state lines for immoral purposes, the exact language of the Mann Act. They had hotel receipts showing Chuck and Janice had shared rooms. They had testimony from club bandstand employees about inappropriate behavior. They had Janice's own words, describing nights in the back of Chuck's Cadillac while his band slept in the front seat, describing things that had happened in hotel rooms across 5 states. But the real evidence was sitting in the defendant's chair. Chuck Berry, successful, articulate, unrepentant. The prosecution didn't need to prove the specific allegations. They just needed to remind the jury what Chuck Berry represented. Here was a black man who had gotten rich singing to their children, who drove expensive cars, who owned property in white neighborhoods, who acted like he belonged in their world. Here was everything they feared about integration made flesh. The first trial lasted 2 weeks. Chuck's defense attorney, a competent but overwhelmed public defender named Robert Prayer, tried to focus on the inconsistencies in Janice's testimony, her history of prostitution, the lack of physical evidence. But Judge George Moore's instructions to the jury made clear what this case was really about. "We cannot allow," he told the 12 white men, "entertainers and celebrities to believe they are above the moral standards that guide decent society." The coded language was crystal clear. Chuck Berry had forgotten his place. The jury deliberated for 47 minutes before returning their guilty verdict. 5 years in federal prison, a $5,000 fine that represented more money than most of them made in 2 years. The destruction of a career that had redefined American popular music in less than 5 years. Chuck sat motionless as the sentence was read, his face revealing nothing, though inside he felt something break that would never fully heal. But Chuck Berry hadn't become the father of rock and roll by giving up when white America told him to stop. Within hours of his conviction, Prayer was filing appeals, arguing that Judge Moore's comments had been racially prejudiced, that the trial had been a sham from the beginning. The legal battle would drag on for another year, keeping Chuck out of prison, but destroying his ability to tour, to record, to maintain the career momentum that had made him America's most influential guitarist. The appeal was successful. In October 1960, a federal appeals court overturned Chuck's conviction, citing Judge Moore's inappropriate remarks and ordering a new trial. For a brief moment, Chuck allowed himself to hope. Maybe justice was possible. Maybe the system could be fair, even to a black man who had dared to dream too big. The second trial began in May 1961, with a new judge and a new prosecutor, but the same 12-man white jury pool that had convicted him the first time. This trial lasted longer, featured more testimony, included character witnesses who spoke about Chuck's contributions to American music. None of it mattered. On June 28, 1961, the jury again found Chuck Berry guilty of violating the Mann Act. 3 years in federal prison, same fine, same destruction. This time, there would be no successful appeal. On February 19, 1962, Chuck Berry walked through the gates of the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, carrying a single suitcase and leaving behind the most revolutionary musical career in American history. He was 35 years old. Johnny B. Goode was climbing the charts, performed by white artists who would become millionaires singing his songs. The Beatles were learning to play guitar by copying his licks note for note. But Chuck Berry was prisoner number 19848-138, assigned to the prison laundry, forbidden from touching a guitar for the next 20 months. The warden, a thin white man named Harold Holt, made the rules clear during Chuck's intake interview. "You're not a celebrity in here, boy. You're just another convict who forgot his place." Chuck nodded respectfully, understanding that survival required a performance more sophisticated than anything he'd ever delivered on stage. But at night, lying in his narrow bunk while 200 other men snored around him, Chuck planned his return. They had silenced his guitar, but they couldn't silence his mind. He wrote songs on scraps of paper, memorized melodies, prepared for the day when he would emerge from this place and show them that you couldn't kill rock and roll by imprisoning its creators. That day came on October 18, 1963, his 37th birthday. Chuck walked out of federal prison into a world that had changed dramatically in his absence. The Beatles had conquered America playing his songs. The Rolling Stones had built their reputation on his guitar licks. Bob Dylan was writing lyrics that matched Chuck's literary ambition. Rock and roll had survived its creator's destruction and evolved into something even more threatening to social order. But Chuck Berry himself was different. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a guarded wariness that would never fully disappear. The spontaneous joy he'd brought to early performances was tempered by knowledge of how quickly success could be stripped away. He continued recording, continued touring, but always with one eye on the government agents he knew were still watching, still waiting for him to step out of line again. The Mann Act prosecution had achieved its goal perfectly. They hadn't stopped rock and roll. That was impossible by 1959. But they had sent a message that resonated through every recording studio, every concert venue, every radio station in America. This is what happens when you forget your place. This is what happens when you think music can change the world. This is what happens when you believe America might actually mean the words it sings about freedom and equality. Years later, when journalists asked Chuck about the trial, his answers were always the same. "I served my time. I paid my debt to society. That's all there is to say." But his songs told a different story. In Promised Land, he sang about journeys from Norfolk to Los Angeles, about traveling through a hostile country that viewed your very existence as a threat. In You Never Can Tell, he created fairy tales of young love that could survive any obstacle, even the ones society created. In everything he wrote after prison, there was an undertone of defiance, a quiet insistence that music was bigger than the men who tried to control it. The Mann Act trial of Chuck Berry was over by 1963, but its implications echoed for decades. Every black artist who found success in white America carried the memory of what had happened to the father of rock and roll. Every song about teenage rebellion, every guitar solo that made white girls scream, every moment of musical integration carried the shadow of Room 314 in the federal courthouse in St. Louis, where 12 white men had decided that Chuck Berry's crime wasn't transporting a minor across state lines. His crime was making white teenagers fall in love with black music, black culture, black joy. And for that crime, the punishment was always going to be as severe as the law would allow. But they had miscalculated. You can imprison a man, but you can't imprison a sound. You can silence a guitar, but you can't silence the echo it leaves in the minds of everyone who heard it play. Chuck Berry walked into that federal prison as prisoner number 19848-138, but he walked out as something more dangerous than he'd ever been before, a living symbol of music's power to survive any attack, cross any boundary, outlast any attempt at destruction. The Mann Act trial was supposed to end the Chuck Berry story. Instead, it proved that some stories are too powerful to kill, no matter how hard you try.